welcome to The Presumption. Hi, Jim. Hi, Matt.
Hey, Sarah.
Hey, guys.
Hi, guys. All right. So we have been having this ongoing conversation about Alec Murdaugh because that is what's happening right now. And of course, we have the man. This is his podcast, my co-host, Jim Griffin. And one of the things, Jim, that I wanted to talk to you about, there has been a letter that was sent by the South Carolina, correct me if I'm saying the title wrong, Ethics Commission or Commission on Ethics, to Clerk Becky Hill, which indicates that Clerk Becky Hill had solicited some ethics advice from this commission because they actually rephrase her request or her ask. Right. And then they go into this analysis essentially of whether she was acting in her official duty. And then they give her some sort of guidance. Now, what stood out to me when I read this letter, essentially, she had asked this commission to let her know if she can write a book. And this is like from, I believe, like May. The letters or the responses from May. I don't know when she sent her request in, but she's saying, I want to write this book about the trial process. And I just went, what? What? No, your book was not about the trial process. Your book was about one trial. It was about the Alec Murdaugh trial. And then I just almost just had to just glance through the rest. So can you please tell us, first of all, that's a misrepresentation in my opinion. I want to hear from you, but also, what is this analysis? Does it give her the okay to write a book, or is it sort of a murky gray area?
Yeah, I guess we should be, careful here. I don't have the language of her request, and her request came in through an email, which I do have somewhere. I just don't have in front of me. Mm-hmm. But she talks about, historical nature and historical cases, and it's going to be, a much broader,
general
book about, clerks of court and courtrooms and trials, et cetera. And clearly, is that what she intended at the time when she sent the email to the Ethics Commission? I don't know, but we know that's not what the product came out. The product was behind the doors of justice about one case, one trial, one defendant, and, the trial of the century in Colleton County. Does that violate one of the ethics statutes prohibitions? I mean, it's kind of a gray area. The opinion, which is non-binding, issued by the Ethics Commission, said it didn't, in the sense that she, in the question they analyze, is she getting paid for her official duties? Is this someone else paying her for something that the state's already paying her to do? And they concluded, no, that, her duties don't include writing a book, giving her observations of historical accounts. But would that opinion change if they knew it was just one book about one case about, behind the doors of justice? I don't know. I'm not going to speak for them. It is a gray area. It's a gray area. I will say is
that, Jim, is that going to, do you think that opinion and of course her ask of the commission will come up in your motion hearing or in this proceeding that has been essentially spearheaded by the motion filing?
No,
you don't think it'll come in?
I don't know. I don't think so, but maybe. I can't say.
Wouldn't it go to knowledge? Well, I don't know. Yeah, you're right. It's really not about the book. It's about jury tampering. Never mind.
Yeah.
Can I ask kind of just like a layman's kind of sequence of events type question about this? Because I'm trying to wrap my mind around it. Was she always, publicly telling people that she was writing this book, or was it just after the verdict came down that she announced she was writing this book and now she's in trouble, and so now she's changing the book that she's going to write? What is the order of events? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the Ethics Commission request came in shortly after the trial, but I can tell you I've interviewed people who she approached in October before the trial,
wow,
asking them to co-write a book with her about the trial.
So she kind of was aware that this super high profile trial was happening on her doorstep, and she was just like, I'm going to be a journalist, quote unquote, and just start talking to who I can talk to and make my penny off this too. I'm not trying to be slanderous. I'm just trying to understand it,
What I can tell you, Matt, is I have spoken to a person who was approached about writing a book with her in October before the January trial started.
So that's what's astounding to me is that, even if things are sometimes not unlawful or unethical, they're just icky, and I have never heard of a clerk of a court, according to now what I just learned from you guys, from you, Jim, essentially planning ahead. She didn't even get the idea during the trial. During the trial, she got the book deal, but before the trial, she was already engaging in what I call the economy of Murdoch. I mean, to me, that's no different from all of these other people who
and she'd given interviews about the book. And when we have taped recordings and videotape of interviews she gave where she said that she had it in her mind. It's a dream of hers. And, it came to fruition during the trial. So, by our own.
But would it be a dream of hers if it was people of the state of South Carolina versus Jane Doe? No, it's because it was Alec Murdoch. It wasn't a regular trial, Anyway.
Yeah. And so, it's caused some people in the judiciary and the court systems to be turned off, to say the least, about this. And one other thing, she said some very inaccurate things about me. She says some very inaccurate things about other people that I know about.
Just what about you?
There's a portion in the book where she's allegedly quoting our IT guy who says, I was nervous about the closing argument. I was rattled. And one of the reasons I was rattled is because I knew that Alec was guilty. And he never said any such thing. And so they're taking it up with her. It's not my battle to take it. I took it up with him. I can tell you that. And he assured me he never said that to her, to anybody. And so, I've heard other people. One of the things, Sarah, that she said about, she misstated in the book that I reached out to Seton Tucker every day after court to see, what the sentiment of the media was about that day.
Way, I introduced you to Seton Tucker when we did the podcast with her.
Well, that's the whole point. Is she got that confused? It was you and I were on Seton Tucker's podcast, and I'd said that you and I spoke after court, and so that's Seton's like, hey, I emailed her and I said, this is not right. And they said they would correct it on the next.
Seton emailed me.
Printing of the book. Yeah.
Yeah. Seton emailed me and said, I know Jim's really busy, but I know you guys are talking. If you think you guys can both come on it. And so I sort of liaison the whole thing. And that's what makes me laugh. But Jim, I just want to close with this. I was driving earlier today and I was thinking, wouldn't it be something that your case, not only, I see this motion for new trial as Pandora's box has just opened, and there's going to be, you don't have to express your opinion. This is my opinion. There's going to be a lot of twists and turns and things that I can't even begin to fathom which road it would be down. But I see not only some form of justice for your client, which God, then I'm definitely throwing a party in South Carolina, because last time it was just we were moping, but also I thought, wouldn't it be something if this case rattles your system down there and makes some changes in the law? Because right now I read an article that the South Carolina ACLU is going to challenge the law that you have that bans prisoners from giving media interviews. And it's because of what happened to Alec.
Right.
And so your case has now become this sort of monumental, I don't know, it's like the machine almost for change, and much needed change. So maybe I'm speaking too soon, but I am living for it. When I read this article today on your Post and Courier or whatever, which I really liked, I followed during the trial. And I thought, God damn, this, there's a lot going on here beyond just for your client. So anyway, that's my prayer.
Well, my pitch to anyone's listening, there are big things that could change, but at a minimum, we need to have some training for clerks of court. I mean, they're not required to go to any training. They're not required to get any certification. The only thing they're required is to get more votes than the next person. And, and so that's got to change. That's got to change.
All right. So stay with us, everybody. We will be right back after a short break. Welcome back to The Presumption. And we're missing Jim Griffin. He's got, I don't know, Matt, what is he doing today? I don't
He's babysitting, he's on, I was going to say dad duty, but is it grandpa duty?
He's playing grandpa duty. Anyway, but we have a very special guest with us, Mack Jenkins. Mack, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sarah. And hello, Matt. Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you as well.
And, I always say we have a very special guest because our guests are all very special, but Mack is extra special.
Thank you.
Because, and I'll get to the story about how we met and stuff. I just want to first introduce him and then let him read a disclosure that his office requires. So Mack Jenkins, I have the honor of calling him a friend now and have worked with him over the years. He's a federal prosecutor. He serves as the chief of the criminal division of the United States Attorney's Office for the Central District of California. That is my district. And so, Matt, I know you used to live here in LA. If the feds come after you, this guy is basically signed off on it. That means that he oversees 7 criminal prosecution sections and supervises over 200 prosecutors. He previously served as the chief of the Public Corruption and Civil Rights Section for 5 years. And most recently, he was the lead prosecutor in the sprawling public corruption investigation targeting the Los Angeles City Hall. This prosecution led to the district's first federal racketeering conviction of an LA elected official, Jose Huizar, who was where I live actually falls within his district, and 10 others, and further resulted in 2 major real estate development companies paying millions in criminal penalties and 2 additional corporations being convicted after trial. Mack, I was following that case, and I know you really cleaned house, okay? And I always say that if I were a prosecutor, never been, but if I was, that's the kind of case that I would prosecute. I public corruption, I'm all game. Mack has completed over 17 federal jury trials, including 6 RICO trials, multiple VCAR murder cases, which is a violent crime and aid of racketeering, plus corruption, civil rights, continued criminal enterprise, and obstruction matters. He has argued before the Ninth Circuit over 10 times. His awards and accolades are up the wazoo and very well deserved. And he previously served years in the Organized Crime and Drug Enforcement Task Force and was a founding member of the Office of Substance Abuse Treatment and Reentry, STAR Court. He's a graduate of Yale Law School and UCLA undergrad. Go Bruins, me too. And he joined the U.S. Attorney's Office in 2008, which brings me to how we met. Let's first get your disclosure out of the way, and then we'll tell the story.
Sure. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Sarah, most of which I wrote myself. Of course, the one thing I didn't print out was the disclosure, but off the top of my head, I'm here in my personal capacity on behalf of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the U.S. Department of Justice. All the opinions I express today are my personal opinion. I cannot speak for or bind our office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, or the Department of Justice. I cannot make any policy statements. My statements are not policy. They're just my personal opinion. So please keep that in mind when listening. So I still have a job after this.
Basically,
and I take it the University of Southern California is also mandating this statement as a UCLA fan. You shall not mention the rivalry in any way, shape, or form.
There would be a longer podcast if I could talk just about UCLA-USC rivalry.
Sorry, Sarah, I cut you off there.
No worries. I was just going to basically hate the play and not the game, right? All right. So interesting story. Mack was, because this was you joined the U.S. Attorney's Office. I just realized in your bio in 2008, and I think
Yep.
this was around the same time that we met. So
Yep.
he was not a new lawyer. He was new to the U.S. Attorney's Office, was coming from a firm, and I was newly in private practice for myself. I was working for other big shot lawyers here, and we're not going to name names or provide details, but I was representing a very good-looking, fine young man who came to me with a passport fraud case. And typically, that's a pretty low-level federal offense. And, you don't see people switching lawyers a million times and, trying to get the best deal, because it's a 0 to 6 month type of offense. And so I couldn't understand it. And his previous lawyer was somebody that I know and respect. And I really couldn't understand why, he was switching, but hey, why not? Whatever. I wanted to help him out and work on the case. So I take the case, and Mack was in court with another U.S. attorney that was sort of supervising him and moved on. And on a 0 to 6 months, speaking of zones, Matt, this was zone A, right? So 0 to 6 months on a passport fraud. And at sentencing, my client got 4 years. And Mack was like, we were friendly. As I've said before, people think that prosecutors and defense lawyers are like, enemies, and they should be enemies. It's like the opposite. We're actually very cordial. We have good relationships. So Mack and I were very, professional and cordial, but like, he was basically like, yo, you might want to go hang your bar card because your client got 4 years on something you should get 0 to 6 months. Well, in all fairness, there were a lot of aggregating factors at his sentencing. There were allegations that he was a white supremacist, spearheaded a lot of violent sort of riots and things, and that he participated in a murder in Las Vegas that sort of he went unscathed for. And so what was really happening, and all that stuff came in, from tattoos to, riots and all kinds of bad stuff at sentencing, which explains the 4 years. And I was just like, oh, my client got 4 years. It's just like, it never really just sat with me. I could never process it. And fast forward, Mack, and this was the plan all along, while he was starting to do his 4 years, the Department of Justice prosecuted him on a civil rights case for really what they really wanted him, which was the murder in Las Vegas. And his sister was involved, a number of people, and Mack prosecuted that case and went to Vegas for that case. And I got a call from Mack after the trial saying, your client's acquitted and he's walking out of prison. And I thought, how did that happen? Now you get to lose your bar card, right? Well, wow. Mack, what happened there? Something happened.
Something bad happened. I can't comment too much. The jury rendered a verdict that we all thought was very, very surprising against, given the evidence, which included his sister admitting that she participated in the murder at his request, his girlfriend at the time admitting that she participated in the murder at his request. Both his sister and girlfriend then, after not have zero criminal histories, never admitted involvement up until this point. They admitted their involvement and both went to prison for many, many years, and then in exchange testified against him, who was, according to their testimony, the ringleader of this, which made sense because he was the leader of a Las Vegas neo-Nazi gang. They were sort of his hangers-on. But they went to prison for a long time for murder, and he was acquitted, and he went home.
But I think that one of the witnesses passed away, right? A key witness for the government.
Yeah, unfortunately, it was a cursed case in many ways, because the other participant, there's 3 participants allegedly involved in the murder. One originally had been convicted by the state and was in state custody. He was the only one, but according to evidence, it was a sort of a mastermind scheme where they ambushed basically 2 rivals who were anti-skinheads. Basically, they were anti-racism, which is an unpopular position to skinheads in Las Vegas. So there was a beef that resulted in the deaths of 2 individuals in the desert. And the evidence was that they were ambushed and led out there by 5 individuals, including 2 women, who ended up being Melissa and Mandy. the sister and the girlfriend, respectively, and then 3 shooters. Only 1 shooter was convicted. He went by the name because he's a white supremacist also. Was convicted by the state. He ultimately testified against Melissa and Mandy, I mentioned, testified against. The second shooter was scheduled. We put him in grand jury. He was going to testify against, but he ultimately was killed in a car accident in New York before the trial, which frankly we thought was very, very suspicious. We looked into it, and unfortunately it's just one of those tragic events.
But when you say my client was a white supremacist or whatever, leading a neo-Nazi group, I mean, that's also allegedly, right? Because the jury came back with a not guilty.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was no check boxes.
Right. But the government's position certainly was that was what was going on. Anyway, it was an interesting case because at the end of the day, Mack and I were even,
Yeah.
But so look, Mack, I mean, I'm going to say this. I always say it to you. I say it behind your back, and everyone that's ever worked with you and our colleagues say the same thing unanimously, which is you're one of the most decent, smartest, and fairest prosecutors that I've worked with in the 2 decades that I've been doing this, and that's just simply your reputation. So when we think about a prosecutor's job is to get justice, not just to hustle for conviction. That you take that oath of office seriously. It really is someone like you, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of prosecutors like you. Everyone should be like you, but you stand out. So I want you to tell us what brought you to do this important job, the way that you do it, and how much of it has to do with your background and family.
Sure. First, thank you for that, none of which I wrote. So thank you, Sarah, for that. Much even more meaningful because it comes from you.
Because it was mine. Yeah.
Because it was yours. Yes, I think absolutely where I am today is, people say it often. I know you think very highly of, your parents and how you grew up, and you told me about your background. Same product, just different scenario. My dad is Black. My mom is white. They both grew up in low-income Long Beach at the time, gang-infested, a lot of racial, not just disparities, but racial violence. My dad was shipped to white schools. My mom grew up in a lot of group homes, and they somehow managed to drag themselves out from low-income, violent streets of Long Beach to going to UCI, University of California, Irvine, which then was about, 10 people in a lot of orange groves. But they both got academic scholarships. They ultimately met there. Even though they went to the same high school, they didn't meet until UCI. By 23, my mom had 3 boys, so she had to drop out of college, but my dad continued on. I'm the second of 3 boys. And they raised us in Irvine, which is very different than Long Beach, where they grew up. And I knew that because we would go to Long Beach to see my dad's side of the family. My mom basically had no family, so I'd always go to my dad's side. And
Mack, for people for our viewers and listeners who don't know where Long Beach is, Long Beach is, like South Bay or south of the airport, let's say the international airport, Los Angeles. And it's an area that neighbors Compton. Everyone's heard of Compton. Some of the violence from Compton sort of, spills over into Long Beach. And then there's a small part of Long Beach that's bougie, but most of Long Beach is still pretty rough. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the easiest way is Snoop Dogg is from Long Beach.
That's right.
I was going to say that just to, get one in there, but I thought,
Yeah, that one was for you. That's where you jumped up in that. Yeah, Snoop Dogg went to Long Beach Poly, which is where both of my parents went to high school. And I went, to contrast that, Irvine is about 40 minutes south in the middle of Orange County, which is a little more less diverse and more politically homogenous, although that's changing too. But by contrast, Irvine, where I grew up, was rated the top safest city by the FBI for like 10 years in a row per capita when I was growing up. And so seeing how I grew up and my brothers grew up, and how we interacted with the police, how we trusted our police, how we knew the police officers' names and they knew our names, and how we trusted the politicians. And the politicians seemed to actually care about the community, not just themselves, compared to some other communities where, to me, the people in power were the enemy. And we seemed like, and my family seemed like, the enemy to the people in power, and how that was incredibly unjust to me, because it seems like the many ways, for low-income people, the odds are stacked against them. And for often people of color, that's how it starts. Not always, but sometimes. But I also saw what it meant like when law enforcement was respected and there was that trust relationship between them and the politicians. And so early on, my dad started at the probation office, Orange County probation. But he always wanted to be a lawyer. He always wanted to be a judge. He had to get a job, multiple jobs to pay for 3 boys while my mom was at home. But sort of the sense of justice definitely comes from my dad. That was just very strong. Equities, both in his own personal experience, again, being shipped from white schools to black schools, but it's just deep in his core. And he definitely bestowed that on me. And I got lucky. I was good at taking tests. I got into UCLA. I was a walk-on on the football team, but really I was good at taking tests, and ultimately got into Yale Law School because I scored highly on tests. And that's because my parents provided me opportunities that they never had. So I could go to law school. I didn't have any, luckily I didn't have 3 kids by 23. I don't know how they did that. But I got an opportunity to do the things they never really did. And so as soon as I learned what the U.S. Attorney's Office did, which to me was combat some of the most significant crimes domestically, internationally, but also at the highest levels, federal officials, law enforcement, political officials. It came to me that, that is something I wanted to do to really change the system, not just put people in prison, but change how people view law enforcement, politicians, ensure politicians and law enforcement respect the community, and really restore sort of the American dream through a prosecutorial system. And that's how I feel it. Like I'm not here to put people in prison. I'm here to reorient it or reinforce how the American justice system people dream about, think of, make sure it stays true to those ideals. The second quick thing I'll say,
story, and you also have to give yourself credit for doing, all your accomplishments. But I think that sense of justice really, I love the story of your dad, and to some extent in your DNA. And now you're a dad. We want to give a holler to Milo and Mackay.
You did it. Oh, I was gonna. Yeah.
Do you do hair on the side as a hobby or what?
I mean, if you look at my hair, clearly people come to me for hair advice. But yes, my daughter, whose hair I'm doing in the front, and my son Mackay, who's in my lap, also a participant. It's a family affair. And this now 7 hours later, Mila was happy with her hair. So it's just a short 7-hour process. She allows to go. I'm pretty sure we're just going to the mailbox at the time also.
Hey, you gotta look good. Gotta look good to get the mail.
I got LA babies. That's a great segue, Sarah, because I was going to say the other reason that sort of fairness is in my DNA, it's because it's in my kids' DNA, because their mother is a federal public defender. So in terms of where do I get my balance from, it's definitely equity and equality is intrinsic to me in my DNA, but also I hear it a lot from the other side, who's literally she's on the other side. So she's the mother of my kids and was a federal public defender, and I absolutely respect that role. And my dad being in probation, they're sort of in the middle. Probation office is law enforcement, also rehabilitative.
Right.
That's how I view doing my job as well, from a middle perspective.
So listen, the important conversation for today. There's so much to talk about, obviously, given what you do, and I'd love for you to come back for other topics. But
happy to.
The America's dying from fentanyl. I mean, basically. I just recently, my goddaughter, her very, very good, her best friend from childhood, who just started going to Brown, who was just a very, very square kid, a guy. But obviously college is when people experiment with drugs and whatnot. Anyway, he just recently, I think, tried something for the first time and just dropped dead. And so there's a lot of these stories, right? And I was looking at, I'm not a statistician, my mother was, but the National Center for Drug Abuse Statistics says that approximately, on average, 100,000 Americans die of drug overdose every year. Around 75% of those are related to opioids, of which 90% approximately is somehow fentanyl related, because now fentanyl is like sugar. It's like in everything, And
I feel like I never even heard the word fentanyl until the Michael Jackson death, and now ever since then, that's just, you hear it all the time, and just like the story that you just shared, Sarah, it's
Michael Jackson.
The boogeyman.
Or you mean Matt? You mean Prince?
Oh yeah, even that was even before, yeah.
Yeah, so Michael Jackson was administration of propofol, which is an anesthetic.
Propofol, that's what it was.
But,
Okay, so
but
that's
Prince was the one that was, yeah, that was sort of like
was
the
the one
big
then.
news fentanyl thing that came with Prince's death. But people ask, that medically there's now we're talking about, I guess, some sort of a vaccine that blocks the opioid element of fentanyl to get to the brain. It still hasn't been, it's not available, but something University of Houston is doing, I guess. Legally, though, whenever the topic comes up and people express a frustration with, well, the government's not doing anything, I'm like, yes, they are. So the reason I wanted you to talk to us about this is to really sort of shed light on what the DOJ and DEA are doing legally to deter, this sort of fentanyl distribution, use, etc. So the DOJ's war against drugs spans decades. We have crack cocaine, we have meth, we have heroin, we have all this stuff, right? And now we have fentanyl. Is it working? Is it going strong?
I'd say kind of. And by why I say kind of is because I actually think of it differently. I think the war on drugs phrase is popular and unpopular for many reasons, but also is pretty archaic in 2023, but specifically as it relates to fentanyl, because it's not really a war. It's not 80s narcos with
Right.
the guy from Game of Thrones, not Pablo Escobar, but the guy, Pascal, the guy in Narcos. Anyways, the popular TV shows of where we were contemplating sort of invading countries to stop the drug trade. Like it was almost in some ways a literal war. And it became more of a metaphoric one. But here I would say it's much more sort of on the sort of smart on crime vibe. And by that, I mean, there's a different strategy. It is certainly an aggressive strategy focused on fentanyl specifically. That strategy is multifaceted. It is both short term and long term. And what do I mean by that is what we'll turn to when we talk about prosecuting street level dealers federally, which we didn't used to do, and prosecuting drug cartels. So there we have a long term focus, and we have a very immediate reactionary short term interest. But that strategy isn't just prosecution. And I say this in lot of topics when I talk about prosecutions, it's never a panacea. Prosecution is never a cure-all. By the time we get to me signing some indictment, it's too late. Something bad has happened.
Right.
We want to prevent by education, definitely general deterrence in terms of letting people know that, yeah, DOJ, you're on DOJ's radar, whether you're in Mexico, in another international abroad country, or you're a low-level dealer. If someone dies from fentanyl, you are now on our radar. The DEA's radar, the U.S. Attorney's Office radar, HSI's radar, FBI's radar. And so multifaceted, both in terms of subject areas, but also in the agencies. So I think it's more a multifaceted strategic approach, and that I think is working because one, we're having podcasts like this where you're recognizing the efforts of the various agencies. And unfortunately, which recognized by the number of prosecutions, which have increased related to fentanyl. Ideally, we see whether it's working by decreased deaths. We're not there yet.
Yeah. So before we even get to that, one of the things that I think people ask is a few things, but task forces, right? So I know that from my fentanyl, beginning in about 2020 or 2021, I started getting these cases involving fentanyl overdose. And I think that from what I can tell, the investigations or the deaths occurred in 2019, 2020. So that's sort of when maybe it slowed down because of the pandemic, but then you started seeing these get indicted in 2021. And they're largely, most of them are the work of the DEA in conjunction as part of a task force, right? So what is a task force, and why is it beneficial to use a task force in these cases? And specifically in fentanyl investigations, I noticed that the feds nab these cases. Sometimes they're already being prosecuted at the DA level locally. Sometimes they're not yet picked up, but there was a overdose death that was investigated. So at some point, the DEA, using its task force resources, nabs these. So can you explain how that process works?
Sure. So a task force just means it's basically a group that comes together from various agencies with a either single mission or a focused mission. We do lots of them. There's corruption task forces, there's environmental task forces, there's PPP fraud task forces. And certainly one of the DOJ's priority are fentanyl task forces. And generally, it is led by the DEA. They're the primary drug enforcement administration for a reason. So they have the experience, and they did lead the war on drugs. But again, I think they've modified and evolved to a more focused and holistic approach. But they are the ones who do the drug investigations. But they partner with local police departments. So we're you mentioned at the beginning, so we're the largest U.S. Attorney's Office in the country geographically. We span 7 counties, basically from San Diego to San Luis Obispo. We have like 20 plus million people. That's double the size of the next biggest district, which is either SDNY or EDNY. I don't say that just to brag. It just means we got a lot of crime and a lot of, unfortunately, fentanyl, a lot of people dying.
But you also said SDNY and where?
EDNY.
Oh, Eastern District of New York.
Yeah, they're more populous districts. We're basically double them.
Okay. Sort of a stupid question here, but as a fan of, a show like The Shield or, these action shows where you hear about a task force, I mean, are these guys literally like wearing the bulletproof vests and like kicking down doors and pulling out boxes of drugs? Or is it much more like we got to get paperwork for a warrant here? Like, how does it really work?
I think like most TV shows these days, they're getting more and more real, but still more fantasy than reality. But certainly in the drug task force arena, there's a lot of doors getting kicked down. There's a lot of bulletproof vests. There's occasionally a Bearcat, which is like, think of a big tank that drives into your front door. Hopefully not yours, Matt. Drives into your front door. But there's certainly that component in drug investigations. But I will say equally if not more important, is how they got there. Meaning we have a federal search warrant, which is ironclad probable cause, which is the standard before a federal judge says you can go, whether it's knock down a door or just knock on a door. We still need a search warrant to get in there. And on the federal side, the other thing we highlight is it is a very rigorous process to do that. So these task forces are dedicated, people filled with integrity that work super hard in order to attack this drug threat. But also they have localized knowledge. So I'd say the real quick thing is they know the dealers, they know the hangouts, they know the houses. So the feds, we have all this big district, and we don't know, DA doesn't know all the pockets of everywhere, but those local police departments do. So it's a force multiplier is the best way to describe it.
So look, are you taking the same aggressive approach if you had an overdose death caused by another type of, scheduled drug like heroin? Do you prosecute that drug the same way, or are you just looking at fentanyl as a completely different category in terms of prosecution?
So I'd say sort of yes to both. We are definitely prioritizing fentanyl prosecutions because, as the stats you listed at the beginning, basically 71,000 deaths last year were related to fentanyl specifically, not just opioids, but fentanyl. Certainly, when you talk about opioids, which heroin is one, they have also resulted in deaths. So we will prosecute a heroin distribution resulting in death. We prosecute we don't prosecute murder for drug dealing generally. We prosecute what's called death resulting. Someone distributed a drug and death resulted. And so whether that's heroin, whether that's some other drug, like you said, the Michael Jackson one, we didn't prosecute that, but we could. But we're focusing on fentanyl because of this number, 71,000. Yeah. We are limited because of the federal government. Like I said, I supervise about 160 AUSAs, but there are 5 times as many DDAs, district attorneys, to do that. So we don't prosecute every drug resulting offense, but we're certainly, again, to your first question, trying to make a statement and an impact on fentanyl specifically. There is clearly, I don't think anyone would object that there's a fentanyl epidemic. There's a
100%. Fentanyl epidemic. And for our listeners, just so they understand the difference, is Mack brings up the DA on the DA level, prosecuting on the DA level versus prosecuting on the federal level. Under state law, you're looking at involuntary manslaughter, which involves, the criminal negligence essentially, and you're looking at 2, 3, or 4 years. If you're a first-time offender, it's basically 2 years. Example would be like Michael Jackson's doctor, Dr. Murphy. It wasn't fentanyl, but it was administering a drug that killed him. At worst, you're looking at second-degree malice murder, which carries 15 years to life, but that is definitely something that is really defensible and can be brought down to involuntary manslaughter. So when the feds nab these types of cases and then prosecute under federal law, suddenly you're looking at a 20-year mandatory minimum, which means that the judge cannot give you less than 20 years. And that's when we say aggressive, that's as aggressive as it gets, right?
I would certainly say it's a game changer, to be sure.
Yeah. So look, Matt, we're going to go into those zones again at the airport.
All right. I got my bags packed. Let's do it.
This was actually something Jim and I were talking about. He's not here, but I promised him I'd ask Mack. The guidelines rely on drug weight, typically to determine the severity of the offense and also how much time the person is facing if they were to plead or get convicted. And there's a huge illegal market for fentanyl-laced pills where a small amount of fentanyl is mixed into a base mixture, then put into a pill press to make, for example, what they sell as oxycodone pills, even though they're not real oxycodone pills, pharmaceutical grade. So under the guidelines, the total weight of all of the pills is typically used to calculate the sentence or the range of the sentence, regardless of the quantity of fentanyl in each pill. So if a person is caught with 1 kilo, this is hypothetical, of pure fentanyl, they're looking at a far less sentence than another person who took that 1 kilo of pure fentanyl and converted it into 10 kilos of fake oxycodone pills. Does the DOJ, or should they, if they don't, take into account the potency of the fentanyl? And shouldn't the 10 kilo defendant get the same sentence as the 1 kilo of pure fentanyl person under the hypothetical?
According to Congress, no, because the Sentencing Guidelines Commission treats as a hypothetical posits that a little, like 1 pill that's all fentanyl or 10 pills that's a little bit of fentanyl in each can be either the same or the smaller potency fentanyls, smaller potency fentanyl pills can be higher. And the reason for it is sort of, if you look into the statutory guidelines and the sentencing guidelines discussions, which I have hopefully for this, is that both are equally, if not more potentially dangerous when you distribute something that's an adulterated pill where somebody thinks they're getting Xanax, like they want to relax. A 17-year-old,
right.
for example, takes it because she's nervous about a test and ends up dead in her high school bathroom. That is very different than someone's like, I need an opioid, I want heroin, I want fentanyl, give me the strongest thing. And again, all victims come in different shapes and sizes, and this isn't to sort of rate victims, but we're certainly focused on unwitting victims who don't know at all what they're getting into. And it may be just a little bit of fentanyl, but they also thought they were going to go to sleep or relax a little bit, not purchasing an opioid. And so when the pills are mass distributed in the example that you described, there's a lot of fentanyl now that is just flooding the market. Whereas if it's just 1 pill of fentanyl, it's going to one person. So in many ways, it is the flood in your description. They are facilitating and broadening the flood of fentanyl to a lot of unwitting users who often are people who could die from just that amount, depending on what else they take. So the argument, and again, I'm not, it is one we make, but also one that's borne out by the research, is that the potential danger of fentanyl being unwittingly and more broadly dispersed is actually one of the things that got us into this epidemic.
Basically meaning that the consumer is not looking for fentanyl, but they end up with fentanyl, right?
Yeah, in some ways, again, the consumer is looking for something very different, or Adderall. I need to take a test or something, something very different. Their body's not accustomed to it, and it reacts.
But you mentioned, selling and et cetera. And, what's interesting is I've obviously, over the course of my career, defended a lot of drug cases in district court, but in the context of fentanyl, my clients they're not sellers. They did not profit financially. There was no financial transaction. They are themselves addicts. And instead they furnished or shared, they say sharing is caring, right? I guess they thought it was caring too. They shared their drugs, right? And somebody died. And so I have a problem with the fact that there really is no wiggle room for people. There's no distinction. Essentially, it's a distinction with no difference. Whether you're selling on the deep web or you're an addict yourself and sharing a pill, you're still facing that 20-year mandatory minimum. How do you think, as a prosecutor, you can reconcile that?
Sure, and I'll just reinforce my caveat because this gets into a little bit of things sure. I sign off in review, and is a very great question. And so again, this is just my opinion and how I view it, and reasonable minds can disagree. And again, this isn't any policy statement, but right. Like you said, they can start out when death results from a drug distribution. You are right. Whoever it is, whatever that defendant is, that putative defendant, they start off in the same spot. Very bad. 20-year mandatory minimum, max life. Doesn't matter who they are. Doesn't matter how many pills they sold. Doesn't matter if they're driving a Lamborghini or, like me, a Honda Civic. They're starting at 20 to life. But because of prosecutorial discretion, which is something both under Attorney General Garland and President Biden, is something that is significant to us, meaning that they want us to treat individual defendants and individual circumstances individually. We don't want to use that hammer when something's smaller. I forget the analogy. You want to take it tailored and customized. So you started that 20-year to mandatory minimum, like you said. Judge can't decide anything lower, max life. Then someone like yourself, Sara Zari, is like, hey, prosecutor, but my guy isn't a dealer. This was his girlfriend and they shared it. He took something too. It's not profit. And those facts fill in, how do we deal with it? We don't obviously overlook or can't overlook the fact that, okay, we hear all that, but that person died. That's the beginning fact. But we do things like remove the mandatory minimum, which means we can do a plea agreement where where we say, okay, well, you're facing this mandatory minimum and either be charged against you or contemplating charge it, but because you're more of a user or it wasn't for profit, or the first time you tried it. That is not justice. That's not, even though someone died and that victim's family may be saying, give that person the death penalty. I don't care who it is.
Of course, yeah. They always do.
Indeed. And that's something we have to face with too, but we balance it out. Well, is this how we should treat it? Is this justice? And again, justice is an easy thing to say, a harder thing to materialize.
But just for people to understand, especially those people who have lost loved ones to fentanyl and are those victims that you just described, those plea deals are also not great. Okay. Those plea deals typically are, like you said, based on the characteristics of the defendant. So if he's an addict, if he doesn't have a criminal history, et cetera, those are concessions that are made in terms of what's offered to them. But the offer still, like, in other words, I'll give an example. Policy in our district where you and I work is we take the 20-year mandatory minimum away, and we offer you a level 38 plea, which MATT, it's down the table in zone D. And it's like, it carries a low end of almost 20 years. So you're taking the 20, but you're replacing it with a different kind of 20 that is more flexible and can be argued against. But again, there's all these different nuances, like putting a floor in the plea agreement where the defendant cannot argue for less than a certain number of years. Usually it's double digits. I mean, I just want people to know this is some serious business. This is not, I have yet to see sweet deals in any context, even when my client is super sympathetic, is provided assistance to the government. Like, I just have yet to see somebody just walking out with like 4 years or 5 years,
I feel like there's an expression about compromises and how, it's only a good compromise if nobody's happy with it. Like, everybody has to kind of feel like they could have gotten a little bit more and maybe next time. And that's just how we get the system to continue going,
So how does intent play into this? So for example, I get some pills, black market pills, and they're for me, but Matt asks me for one and I want to give it to him. I have no idea that it's laced with fentanyl. But as it turns out, the evidence turns out, you guys test the pill, there was fentanyl in it, and now I'm charged with this, fentanyl facing 20-year mandatory minimum. Obviously I didn't intend to distribute fentanyl. How do you prove intent in this context?
Sure. I guess the easiest way to explain it is that intent that you described doesn't matter. Whether you thought it was fentanyl, whether you thought it actually was Adderall for Matt, he's trying to study for the next podcast. He's got to, help out.
Got to keep that Adderall addiction going. That's how I do pods, baby.
He's got extra energy to deal with Sara. I get it. But unfortunately or fortunately, you are treated the same, meaning that the defendant doesn't need to know that it was fentanyl. He does need to know that it was a controlled substance, meaning that it was an illegal act providing Matt an illegal drug. And it's the same as sort of, you don't get to pick your victim in a murder case. If you punch a victim in the face and he falls down and his skull gets shattered and you've, as a result, killed him, you get charged with murder, even if you're like, it wasn't even that hard of a punch. It is analogous in the drug distribution, particularly as the fentanyl, that you were still charged with, even if you didn't know. You distributed drug, check box 1. Check box 2, that person died. And then with those 2 boxes checked, you are in a lot of trouble as a defendant.
So you don't have to know what you're giving the person is the particular drug that is prohibited.
Exactly. Just that it is a prohibited drug. If you thought you were giving Matt, like my kid take Paw Patrol vitamins. If you thought you were giving Matt Paw Patrol vitamins, turns out those are laced with fentanyl. We would not charge you. We could not charge you because it's not an illegal prohibited drug. But
otherwise, the schedule for the prohibited scheduled drugs are interchangeable. So long as they fall within one of those categories, then it doesn't matter if it was something else that was deadly. You don't need intent, right?
You do not need intent. But obviously, I'll just say real quick. But obviously, intent matters not always for elements, meaning what we need to prove a crime has been committed, but how that crime is treated, how that crime is punished. So if you, Sara, knew like, hey, I'm giving Matt a bunch of fentanyl, I'm not going to tell him it's fentanyl because then it'll lower the cost, because I think he's getting high quality cocaine. In fact, it's just fentanyl makes my high end profit better. And you do that, then we would treat you very differently than the person who thought it was just normal cocaine. So there are ways to deal with it sort of at the back end or the sentencing to show that the same crime was committed, but in the latter example where the fentanyl was hidden and knowingly hidden, that's much more aggravating. So then you're looking at already a significant sentence to start, but those kind of things.
Aggravating factors that take it up. Yeah. So my understanding is that fentanyl isn't, that it's coming from China and Mexico. Is the fentanyl problem a local problem in terms of production and supply? Is there any organized crime, gangs, et cetera, producing fentanyl, distributing fentanyl, or is it largely, you know what I'm saying? Like we had meth labs, right? Do we have fentanyl lab issues?
So very good question. And I'll answer this one high level because it gets into things that aren't yet for public disclosure. But we think the fentanyl epidemic is an international concern that involves a very domestic concern, meaning clearly a lot of people in the U.S. are dying from fentanyl. And then examples you sort of highlighted from other U.S. people. People aren't flying to overseas to get fentanyl and then coming back. They're getting it from their neighbor, from their person, sometimes from their partner, from their doctor, from their professional. But we would say that the flood of it and the creation of it, we do not believe to be domestic. There is a lot of influx from at least over the Mexican border. We don't believe that all of it, it's certainly not all coming from Mexico. It's certainly not all created in Mexico, or not all of it, we call them the precursors, we don't think come from Mexico. So it's a multi-step process that ends up in our backyard, starts somewhere else, and we are trying to combat it at each possible step. Interdictions overseas. We have one of the largest ports in San Pedro in the country. So that means a lot of nice TVs and stuff comes in, also drugs and precursors. Things go to Mexico and come created, and sometimes they come up through the borders. There are pill presses. Pill presses can do like 5,000 pills.
Right.
You'll get some powder in like an hour. A lot of those, we've done search warrants where we seize pill presses in the U.S., which means people are doing stuff in the U.S. So it is, I'd say, a very, unfortunately, international and very domestic problem.
Is there any benign reason why somebody like Matt or me would have a pill press in their house?
Maybe you, Sara, because a lot of workout people say that they create their own vitamins. That is under defense. So I could see you.
What's up? You saying I don't work out? Come on, Mac. You don't know me.
Listen, no, I'm a Celsius guy. You put some Celsiuses and you're good. Sara, who I've seen on the next level. So listen, I feel like I work out, but I'm not on Sara's level.
So you guys, I want to end with two really important things, which is the trial, I should say, of these cases, and then the defenses typically in these prosecutions. Most, I say this a lot across platforms, that most federal indictments settle by plea. They just do. The feds have great resources. They do they run really tight ships in terms of investigation. And I'm not saying there aren't issues that are triable, but typically, I've had many instances where I've thought this one for sure is going to go to trial. And then, much to my dismay, it doesn't, because, I end up consulting with an expert and learning that it's going to fall flat and my client's going to get convicted. So, you guys have, your conviction rate is far greater than, in other words, I should say the statistics of settling by plea is far greater than, let's say, on the state side, right? Yes. But recently, a fentanyl resulting in death case went to trial here in LA in your district. Can you tell us about why that defendant was found guilty? Just basically, what was the evidence about, and why did he go to trial, and why was he convicted?
Sure, and I think you sort of alluded to this earlier in some of your questions. The other thing we need to prove, we mentioned drug distributed, whatever type of drug it is, the result
causation.
Is causation, exactly. Mm-hmm. And in a death resulting case, the causation, which just means we also have to prove that it was that fentanyl that killed that person, not asthma or some precondition or some other drug. We have to get it right. And so the causation is always the most significant in a death resulting case. So that is, like you said, you need an expert to testify to that. The second thing besides causation, and so it's called the but-for cause, meaning there's a bunch of factors that led to this poor person's death. But which was the but-for? Meaning, but for that drug being inserted into that drug cocktail or their personal health cocktail, they would not have died. Remove that X factor, and that person is still alive. Put that X factor back into that cocktail, that person is dead.
Is the but-for factor the same thing as a substantial factor?
It is not. So it's higher. Substantial is like, I'm pretty sure that this was a big contributor, but they might have died anyways. But-for is like, you need to prove, it's like up here. The but-for, they could have had all these terrible things, but we need to prove that but for this, they would have survived. So it's actually higher than substantial because it doesn't create a direct link between the drug and the causation. But
so is that what this defendant was, basically his defense was that it was not a but for the fentanyl?
No. Yeah, so the second thing that goes with the causation is that defendant is the one that provided the but for drug. And here, in the case you're talking about of Declan Wilson, I believe, the son of a South Bay mayor, his defense, which is often the defense, is someone else gave that person the drug, not me. I gave him drugs. I'm guilty of being a low level, like you said, street level dealer. Here, they were friends, allegedly. If you read the text message between them during the deal, where Declan ultimately was making fun of the victim, who was a 15-year-old boy who took what he thought was Xanax or some similar drug, and was concerned about how he was feeling after he took the drug, and was texting his drug dealer, Declan Wilson. And Mr. Wilson was making fun of him about how he was taking it, how he took it, and how it wasn't working. And then ultimately it worked in the way that caused his death. But Mr. Wilson's defense was that, I'd sell him drugs, but he got those drugs somewhere else. And often that's the case, because these days, unfortunately, here, even a 15-year-old boy can go on Snapchat, can go on Instagram, and get a host.
And those that are addicted also get drugs from different sources. I mean, it's the hallmark of addiction is to shop drugs. You go to one doctor, and then you go to the street guy, and then you go to the neighbor, and you just can't get enough, right? So you get it from different places. But I've had cases where there's text messages, and so we're talking about circumstantial evidence, right? So there's text messages. There is the movement of a car, the cell phone ping to the towers, which is not reliable evidence in every case. I've had situations where cell towers have pinged my client's phone, and I was able to prove that he was miles away. But when you put all of this together, and then, in one case I had the victim's boyfriend who saw her go outside and pick up the pills. And then they had the person that delivered the pills pinging the towers, picking up the pills from the defendant's home and then bringing it over to the victim's home. So they had all of this. And then they had the toxicology. And I thought that, like Mack said, toxicology or the but-for factor, and that whether the defendant is the supplier, are two things that you can claim in defense. And I can't tell you how many times I've thought that I can go that route and I hit a dead end, and I go back to the other route and I hit a dead end. And so that's what ends up, in the arena of the plea negotiations, where you just realize that you're taking a risk that is far greater than the client. Client would definitely do a lot more time if he was convicted. The one thing I also found interesting that I explored recently, Mack, is the affirmative defense under the joint user rule, which almost applied to one of my cases, which is basically if you are purchasing the drug together and then using it, then technically under case law, you are not distributing it, because you're not getting it from a source and then providing it to the victim. You're going there together, you're picking it up together, and you're putting your money in together. All these things matter, right? It's a factual kind of scenario. And I thought I could use that in my client's defense, but I technically couldn't, because despite all of these other, historically, for like 2 years, there was evidence of him using fentanyl, or what they thought was oxycodone, but it was fentanyl, with the victim. On this one occasion, they did not go out and pick it up together. She asked for it, he provided it. So it's classic distribution, even though there's no financial transaction. And so, that's something obviously people can explore, but I guess I just want to send the message that the government is not taking this lightly, that even when we're offered plea deals, they are not kind deals. And obviously, as Mack confirmed, the law does not really care whether you're making money or that this thing is fentanyl or not. Basically, if you're sharing because it's your friend, it doesn't matter. You're going away for a long time. And so do you see this, Mack? Where do you see this headed? Like, where do you think this is going to go on for a while, or you think it's going to die down sometime soon?
So I think it's headed in the right direction because of awareness. I think awareness, both in the education, again, we're not just prosecuting people and putting people in prison for long periods of time, although that is certainly part of the multifaceted approach. We're also going to schools. We're doing PSAs, because that's where a lot of these people
are.
We are, yeah. We do go to schools, and Martine, the U.S. attorney, has been filming a PSA because people don't know, again, I want to study for my test. I want to go to sleep. These are colleagues here, colleagues of, like you said, of yours, friends of yours. Everybody's dying from this. There's no race limitation. There's no socioeconomic limitation. There's no professional limitation. Yeah. This is a true drug epidemic. And you're absolutely right. We are addressing that epidemic. We think that epidemic proportionally, creatively, both in short and long term. I won't use the term aggressively. I'll say creatively, but we are going to make it known that if someone dies as a result of fentanyl, we are going to do everything in our possible to make that victim's family seek justice or be able to receive justice.
And we're actually going to be interviewing one of the episodes is going to be an interview that is with Sam Quinones, who was a LA Times journalist and wrote a couple of books on the opioid crisis, and the latest one being on the fentanyl crisis called Dreamland. Really great book, more of like a town by town synopsis of the problem across the nation. And we're hoping to also talk to a medical doctor about this vaccine, because I'm very curious about how that might help. But it's an important topic. And I just want to also say that the relief that sometimes is available to defendants who are convicted and sentenced, like under the First Step Act, for example, the minute there's death involved, fentanyl or otherwise, most of those programs they disqualify for. So recently there was proposed amendments to the guidelines for 0-point offenders, people that have never had, don't have a criminal history. That means they have 0 points. They can get another 2 levels off of their offense level. Well, guess what? If there's death, you don't qualify for that either. So I can't tell you how many times my clients email me from MDC or wherever they're housed, can I qualify for this? Can I qualify? My answer is like, no. I mean, there is really, it is very aggressive, and there's no relief. So that makes people feel better that the government's doing something. I'm not happy with the way, I mean, I'm happy the government's addressing this, but I'm not happy about how my clients are getting punished just the same as big drug dealers. That's my biggest issue.
I'm confident, Sarah, that's where you earn your money at sentencing. You just unfortunately have to wait to get to that part where you make your pitch. But I think that's absolutely right. That is the message. We want drug dealers, people on the street, friends and romantic partners, whoever it is that purchases drugs, whether for themselves or to give to somebody else, to have second and third thoughts, that if something horrible happens, one, may mean you die, someone you care about die, and that may not be the end of it for you. You may get prosecuted, you may be in prison for a significant period of time. So ideally somewhere along that thought process, they're like, maybe we'll just go to the movies instead.
Mack, I am so grateful to you for joining us. I know how busy you are, and now you're the boss over there. So you have a lot of duties now. You have dad duties too with summer, and so squeezing us into your agenda means the world to me. I really appreciate it. I also appreciate whoever in that office allowed you to join us. I appreciate it. And I hope that you come back and talk to us about so many other important issues that are in your wheelhouse.
I'm happy to. This was great. Matt, again, great to meet you. Sarah, thank you for everything, including the books for my kids, which I showed them. They like the autograph. They're really into autographs these days. So thank you to Bakari for signing that book.
And the Presumption Cup, right? You got a Presumption
Cup. The Presumption Cup, although I of course, did forget that. I only have UCLA, but I do have the Presumption Cup. Next time, I'll actually bring it like you told me to with the podcast.
Thank you, Mack.
No problem.
Oh, wait, hold on. I got to say something at the end of this, right, Matt?
You sure do.
Yeah.
We'll just remind people to subscribe to our show. If you're not already, you can do so on any of the podcast platforms that you listen to. Also, check us out on YouTube. You can watch all the episodes. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, @ThePresumption. And Sarah, until next time,
we rest.